Hi, the world is seeing some tremendous changes in economic, social and technological changes which are impacting on many businesses, organisations and education. Nowhere is this more clear than in the world of open and distance learning. And the Commonwealth of Learning has brought together three world leaders in this field to talk about the impact of these changes on open and distance learning. My name is Tony Bates. I'm the Director of Distance Education and Technology at the University of British Columbia in Canada. Before that, I was Executive Director for Strategic Planning, Research and Information Technology at the Open Learning Agency in Vancouver. And before that, I worked at the British Open University for 20 years. Now, I'd like to introduce the panel. First, I'd like to introduce Professor Ram Reddy, who at the moment is the Chair of the Indian Council of Social Science Research, and before that, the Chairman of the University Grants Commission in India. But his primary reason for being here is he was Vice President of the Commonwealth of Learning and Vice Chancellor of the Indira Gandhi National Open University. The next panelist is Judy Roberts. Judy has a long experience in Canadian distance education. She was one of the founders of telemedicine at Memorial University in St. John's, and then went on to do the same kind of thing at the University of Toronto, and was also a project manager at Contact North in Northern Ontario. At the moment, she's an independent consultant to the the Council of Ministers of Education of Canada, Canadian Federal Government, and a number of other organisations. And lastly, we have Dr. Richard Siaciwena, who is the Director of the Directorate of Distance Education at the University of Zambia in Lusaka, and was formerly Director of the Centre for Continuing Education in the University of Zambia. So, lady and gentlemen, I guess my first question is, what is the relationship between these economic changes and the very rapid growth in open and distance learning? Who'd like to start, and what's the reason for this big surge in open and distance learning at the moment?
Well, the relationship is very, very close. In fact, open and distance learning has been responding to the changes that are taking place in the society and in the economy. The conventional system imposes certain restrictions. Therefore, conventional system is not able to meet those challenges. Take the case of school education or large participation in higher education. That cannot be met by the conventional system. Therefore, distance education is being used by the policymakers. And as you are aware, there has been a lot of expansion in open and distance learning all over the world, particularly in continents like Asia.
Is this because distance education is cheaper than conventional education, or are there other reasons for this?
Yeah, I think I'll take the African scenario and say that I think when you look at the 1970s, the 1980s, there was some kind of stagnation in the provision and development of distance education. But in the 90s, you can see an upsurge of distance and open learning activities, mainly because of the inadequacy of resources to expand the conventional institutions. And so many governments feel that it's cheaper to develop and provide this, education through open and distance learning.
Do you agree with that, Judy, that it's cheaper?
I'm not sure that I agree that it's cheaper in all contexts. I know that some of the research we've been doing recently, it's been very difficult to get a handle on good cost data with respect to the behaviors and costs of different kinds of technologies and different types of approaches. So in my own mind, I have to say I think my jury is still out on that, and I'm still in search of information. On a case study basis, there's some very good evidence that it can be cheaper, and I think that's obviously very attractive to us all as we're trying to struggle with declining resources and growing need and growing demand.
So what are the reasons other than cost is driving governments and institutions to move to open and distance learning?
I think I'll still come back to cost. In the African context, education is free of the direct cost to the consumer. Governments have to provide, for all the necessary, facilities, and therefore, it's even without, working out, costs statistically. You are able to see that it's cheaper for the government to sponsor a distance student than to sponsor a full-time student. I'll take the Zambian experience, for example. It costs, in the Zambian currency, 1.5 million kwacha to sponsor one full-time student on the part of the government. And yet, it's a fraction of that is spent on a distance student because they are not in residence. And so, in general terms, you can actually straight away, see that there's a cost saving if you develop distance and open learning.
Well, in addition to that, another consideration is the numbers to be covered. Wherever you have large numbers, I think distance education is the only answer. While for policymakers, cost is an important consideration, they also take into account the numbers to be covered. Through the conventional system, it is extremely difficult to cover large numbers. And thanks to modern technologies, which distance education uses, it is possible to reach the large numbers. You look at the figures of Chinese Open University, they say it's about 1 million students. In our own country, I think the Indira Gandhi National Open University has got about 250,000 students on its rolls. To cover 250,000 students, through the conventional system, you have to establish 10, 15, 20 universities. So that's an important consideration for policymakers.
Yeah. Yes. Perhaps to illustrate with the Zambian example, I'll talk about the university level distance education. The output, in a population of about 8 million, the output from high school, secondary education is about 20, 25,000. And yet, less than 2,000 of those are able to enter higher education institutions. And then you consider the other dimension, the population growth rate. Zambia and other African countries have very high population growth rates. In Zambia, for example, it's anything between 3.5 and 3.7. And so you find that the Zambian population is young. And this inevitably exerts a lot of pressure on the school system. So the demand, for education is quite high, and yet the resources to develop or expand the conventional institutions are very limited. So there's a relationship between the social, factors and the economic factors, if you like.
I think one of the interesting things as I hear you both discuss your context, I'm thinking that one of the contexts in Canada, for example, at the post-secondary level, is the existing ways in which governments have structured their funding programs. And one of the surveys that we've done with Statistics Canada has indicated that roughly 80% of the costs of campus-based education are covered in one way or another with federal or provincial government funding. And that sources of revenue such as tuition fees and the interest from private donations is really only covering about 20% of the cost of campus-based education. But when you look at how off-campus or distance or open and all of those labels would apply, the trend is the exact opposite. Distance education units, continuing education units in Canadian post-secondary institutions have been expected to be largely self-funding. And so as much as 80 to 90% of the costs of distance education are recovered by those units through the tuition fees and other sources of revenue that they generate. And so in Canada and perhaps other countries that have that kind of funding pattern for their education, certainly the policymakers are quite interested to look at how it is that distance education has managed to be self-sufficient and not require as much government money. And we're just beginning to really look at that in a serious way and try to examine how far one could roll out that model of self-sufficiency. If larger numbers of people were educated that way, would you still be able to get that, as it were, savings to government in terms of, and pass on some of the cost to the student or to the employer or whoever is going to pay the tuition fees. So,
while we're on the costings and the costing side of distance education, how are certainly in developed countries we see a move in many developed countries towards privatization of education, or the consumer, the student paying more. How is that impacting on distance education itself, other than being seen as a cheap way? Does it change the way that distance education operates? And are we seeing similar things in developing countries as well?
I certainly think that some of this is beginning to challenge educators to indeed start to use some of the language of as the learner as a customer. And while the paradigm of private enterprise, where the customer knows best and the customer has the right to expect certain standards in the product, I don't think that model works as a total paradigm for education. But I certainly think, personally, it's very healthy that educators are being asked to be a bit more accountable to the people that they are serving in the kind of service that they are giving. And I think that in a very broad philosophical way, if you will, asking us as educators to take a bit more account of the people that are, quotes, paying us is a good discipline and forces us to ask some really important questions about what we are offering and what the benefits are to the people that we are offering or supposed to be serving. I think that's a very healthy debate.
Tony, what has been happening is during the last few decades, there has been a total change in the thinking of governments and funding agencies. They've started saying that higher education institutions should raise their own revenues. Not that they should be self-supporting, but they must raise the revenues. That was not the thinking in many countries, certainly not in the developing countries. Now in the developing countries also, the governments are saying that higher education institutions should raise some revenues on their own. And this is a new thing. It's completely new to us. But that is changing mainly because governments do not have the resources to give to the higher education institutions. Now, in the case of distance education, there is nothing new. All along, for some strange reason, the policymakers have been saying that distance education institutions should generate their own revenues, whereas they were prepared to spend a lot of money on the conventional systems. They were not prepared to spend enough money on distance education institutions. This is one of the attractions of distance education to the policymakers. Then not only that, it doesn't stop there. If you ask some of the dual mode institutions in India, the vice chancellors say that they have started a distance education unit or a course to earn some money for the university.
A dual mode institution is one that teaches on campus and also has distance teaching programs as well.
Exactly.
Right.
So there are cases in India where the universities have started new distance education programs to earn money for the university. Now, I have nothing against earning money, But if you earn money through the distance mode, you spend that money on the improvement of distance education. That is not the case. They earn money here, spend elsewhere, that is subsidize the conventional system. This is what is happening in several universities.
That's an interesting point, and one that's very close to me, because my own university has just created my position partly to increase revenues, I'm sure. Not just because I'm a nice guy, you know. And that's a very interesting point about what should be done with the surplus. Should it go back into the conventional system, or should it be used for increasing the openness of distance learning? Let me get on to one of the social issues here. When I first went to work for the Open University in 1969, the whole rationale for the university was to widen access, to equalize opportunities, to allow students who often came from poorer working class families to get access to university level education. Now I'm hearing a rather different story about the economic drivers of distance education. Would any of you like to comment on that? Are we denying access by being more cost conscious?
I was going to follow on with very much in that vein, Tony, and say that to me it's very interesting that one of the ways in which government is spending money on distance and open learning in Canada, and I think in a few of the other developed countries such as the United States, is through their investment in technology. And we've all heard this horribly overused word, the information highway or super highway or infrastructure, whatever the code word is in our various countries. But certainly in Canada, what I see happening is that government is making the link between an investment in the network infrastructure of technology such as digital, fiber optic, all these enhancements. And governments are investing in that technology infrastructure. And while they're doing it because they see economic benefits in terms of improving the competitiveness of Canadian industry, and they see an enormous advantage in building on Canada's strengths in information technology just as a pure business area, and so they hope that businesses will recover and earn money. I hear a lot of talk about they're also investing in it because they do see that the information highway is going to have a substantial role to play in learning. Indeed, the Information Highway Advisory Council in Canada has said that it believes that one of the key design elements to Canada's information highway should be lifelong learning, which they're using in a very inclusive sense to include what we've traditionally labeled distance education and open learning, but they're also talking about conventional institutions incorporating the use of technology into their activities in a more real way than institutions have ever done before, and they see the return on that investment in technology being that Canada will have, generally speaking, a more educated population, and that a more educated population, of course, will be able to ultimately earn more money and put more tax dollars back into the system. And so there's the whole issue of the return on investment in education generally being part of government policy in terms of dealing with some of the recessionary and economic challenges that certainly Canada has faced, as in many other countries in both the developed and the developing world.
Well, that's a really interesting argument, Judy, and I'd really like to get the reaction of both of you from your countries. I mean, how does this argument sound to you? Does it sound relevant to you, or does it sound threatening?
I think we have to look at various factors that condition the development of distance education in African countries in particular. One, before I forget, I think I should acknowledge, the role of the Commonwealth of Learning in sensitizing, government officials, ministers, to the need, to adopt, distance education as a means of, widening access to all levels and sectors of education. But I think you have to look at the political changes that are taking place now, particularly in Africa. I'll take my country, Zambia, as an example. The reintroduction of multi-party, politics, the democratic changes that have taken place have also come with changes in the way the economy is planned and managed. And now we are talking about the market forces, liberalized economy, where because of the certain economic measures, companies are affected in terms of growth. Some organizations are being, liquidated, their forwarding, and so on. So there are so many things that are happening. And one thing that comes out is that there's a tendency now to move away from the dependence syndrome that characterized the past, 27 years of the Zambian, political scene. And so there's some element of competition, if you like. Companies have to, compete. And the best way of doing that is investing in human resources development. And also individuals are aware that now you can't keep your job because you are known to the manager or what, but that you must have the skills. And one best way of surviving is to retrain, to go for professional upgrading. And so individuals are willing to pay for their education. And of course, they can't leave their jobs, so they have to look to distance education. And as Ram already said, the system in countries like Zambia is that distance students have been paying, for themselves anyway. The problem has been with the, full-time internal students, if you like. In all colleges of further education in universities, people are used to receiving grants from the university. Now they are being told the government cannot meet the cost of their education. And there's some kind of an irony here. Distance education is partly adopted because of the fact that the government has limited resources. But on the other hand, the government does not have enough resources to support, distance learning programs adequately. And so distance learning programs, distance students have to, bear the burden to a certain extent of, providing or receiving, distance education.
I think Richard's raised a very important point here about differences in the student population between distance education and campus-based students. So, on the one hand, the distance education programs have been put in place to cope, certainly in many developing countries, with the expansion of students coming through the high school system. But in Canada, I think we're seeing the major pressure for distance education coming from more mature students who want to come back and continue their education and continue their training. Did you see that as well, Judy?
Oh, very definitely, very definitely. There's no question that businesses are certainly starting to push down on their employees to invest in their own training, just as you were saying is happening in Africa, Richard. And surveys that agencies such as the Conference Board of Canada have done certainly indicate that companies see technologies, and I use that term technology-based learning rather than distance learning, because it covers more of what we think of as distance education. Companies are planning to double and triple their use of what they would call just-in-time technology-based training. 2 years ago, there were something like 22% of large and medium-sized companies in Canada that reported they were using distance education. Now it's 36%, and they would estimate that 50% of companies will be using distance education. One of the issues that leads me into, though, is that when you look at the question that the Conference Board of Canada has asked, There's one category that says, are you using distance education and do you plan to increase it? But the other options that they've given are things like computer-based education, video conferencing, correspondence courses, all these other techniques that we have always included in our term distance education and open learning. And so if you added up all of those, because our sense of distance education would include them, then, quote, technology-based learning is really a quite significant proportion of what companies are doing. And at the policy level, many of them have policies which indicate that they will subsidize employees' tuition fees if they go to a college or a university course, but the employee is expected to contribute their own personal time. So you're expected to work for the company during working hours, and then you will get some investment and support from the company for your ongoing investment in your skills. But because there is the sense that we may all be changing jobs every 5 or 6 years, that the pool of human capital is going to move around companies, there's also this sense that the investment should be a shared one between the companies and the individuals, because both are going to get some benefits, but everybody is going to keep moving. And so I need to pay for my tuition because I can't be sure that the company is going to employ me 5 years from now. So it's a partnership between the employer.
Do you see this movement of open and distance learning into the business and industrial sector in India?
Yeah, it's very much there. What is happening in countries like India and a number of other developing countries is the approach of distance education itself is changing. In the beginning and for a very long time, the approach was that it can be used only at the tertiary level and only for mature students. That's no longer the case. Now they want to use it for school education and certainly not for mature students. It's going to be used, and it is being used in some countries at the school level. For example, we have a national open school in India, and that's going to develop in a big way. The other change that has taken place is using distance education for technical and vocational education. This is also coming up in a big way. And the most important thing is what Judy has just said. The large companies want to train and retrain their employees. And the only way to train a large number of people is through the distance method. Even governments want to use this to train their employees. Now, you raised a very interesting question in the beginning, and that is when distance education was started, the approach was that it would be cheap to the student, and those who can't afford also can join distance education programs. Now, there is some change in that. Today we have two types of learners in distance education. Those who are employees and earning members. For them, cost should not matter. But there are those who are not earning. I think the distance education institutions or managements should look at that, the second aspect, where people are not earning. If it is made very expensive, costly, they would not be able to join these courses.
I'd like to follow up on the technology issue here, and particularly in countries like Zambia, less so perhaps in India. And again, related to that question, and that's the access issue. Do you feel that the move to increasingly technology-based distance education in developed countries is going to lead to a widening of the gap between developed and developing countries? Will it widen differences? Or do you see there are opportunities in developing countries as well for technology applications?
Yes, they are, except, I mean, it's quite obvious that there is already a gap in terms of the levels of development in technology. When you talk about distance education in countries like Zambia or in Africa, you are actually, talking about the dominance of, printed materials. You can't talk about, computer-assisted learning, for example. You can't talk about computers and so on. But I think there's one medium which we can call the traditional medium. Radio promises to offer wider opportunities, not only for formal school equivalents, distance learning programs, but also in non-formal education. Yes, there is a gap, but many countries are slowly, catching up in terms of the development of technology. And as I said, the main medium, which I think has potential, is radio, combined with the printed materials. And to a certain extent, educational television might be, relevant, especially in non-formal education.
Tony, I just would like to add that even in Canada, the gap is a very real issue of public policy concern, and that this same Information Highway Advisory Council I was mentioning earlier, their working group on learning and training has been spending quite a bit of time looking at the negative impacts of the information highway and the gap between learners who happen to live in communities with a population base to justify the investment is a significant gap. At best, for example, Canada's consortium of telephone companies expect that they will be able to provide digital service to approximately 80 to 90% of homes and businesses by the year 2005. So that means there's 10 to 20% of Canadian homes and businesses that are not going to get the new information highway, even under the best scenario that the public or that the private suppliers foresee. And that 10 to 20% is certainly the same, full circle coming back, that those were the kind of people that we were concerned with initially in terms of the access and the social equity. And that is not going to go away in spite of the massive public and private investment in information highway and other kinds of technologies.
Yeah, just to
Tony, I think when you talk of technologies, we are in two different worlds. When you say technologies, in the advanced countries, you have the most recent and advanced technologies in mind, such as computers and superhighway and whatnot. In the case of developing countries, they have in mind, say, radio and television.
Mm-hmm.
These are the new technologies for them,
Mm-hmm.
in addition to the print material. They can't think of using the telephones. They can't think of using computers in a big way. Therefore, there is a big gap between the developed and developing countries when we talk of technology. But that should not bother, because whatever technology is readily available should be used in the developing countries. I don't think that should bother the policymakers. Radio and television can be used extensively for providing greater access and improving distance education.
Sorry, Richard, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to say what Rama said, and perhaps emphasize the point that I think the best is to make the best use of what is available,
Right.
and perhaps not concern ourselves in our own situation about what is happening in the West, but at least, okay, it's important to be aware of what is happening, trying to catch up. I think in the end, the important thing is to get the best of what we have.
Well, that raises an interesting question for me then. It seems to me that you're saying that The new technologies are an advance, or sorry, not the new technologies, the old technologies of radio and television and print and distance education enables people to be taught at least as well as in the conventional system. So my question is, do the new technologies like computers and multimedia, do they actually add value over the old technologies, and are they impacting on the way that we're teaching in distance education? I hear a lot of hype about the new technologies, but I have to say that I found very few actual applications of these new technologies in distance education. I wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
Tony, you have raised some of these issues in your own books. True, the newer technologies are more efficient, there is no doubt about it. But more or less similar results can be achieved through the older technologies. You see, there is no point in complaining that newer technologies are not available in the developing countries. Whatever is available should be made use of. Well, as and when the newer technologies are available, certainly we will use them. But it doesn't mean that distance education would not grow in these countries without these technologies. Mm-hmm. That would be our approach.
When you look at what is happening, certainly in Canada, in terms of what distance educators are really using, the survey results consistently show that print, audio cassettes, video cassettes are the most frequently used technologies still in distance education programs. Now that is obviously changing, partly because governments are developing programs in almost every province and nationally to encourage use of these new technologies. Saskatchewan just has issued a new multimedia policy for Saskatchewan. I think the challenge that we have as distance educators is to say, surely we can lay to rest the question of, do technologies work? We know that they all do, and they can if they're used appropriately. Yes, we want to use these new technologies and make sure we understand them, but I would like to think that we're able to move beyond those kind of, does technology work and will multimedia work, and get back to some of the issues about outcomes of education. Why are we really there? If conventional educational institutions such as UBC are hiring Tony Bates because the University of British Columbia, which is a traditional research institution in Canada, and University of Toronto is doing the same thing, if the conventional big research institutions are seeing that technologies have a substantial role in their activity across the board, then that to me opens up the opportunity that we can get back to the fundamental questions of how can we serve our learners, what are the outcomes that we want in education, and I would like to think that if we maybe focus more on those kind of what outcomes and what capacities do we need to offer our learners, some of the issues of there is a gap is eliminated, and we can look at the commonalities that we share as educators and the challenges of giving our learners the outcomes that they need without necessarily phrasing it so much in terms of there's a gap between do you have radio and I have computers. The question is, can we agree on the capacities that we should be giving our learners for their quality of life, no matter where they are?
One great contribution made by the new technologies is to convert the policymakers into votaries of distance education. Now the policymakers think that distance education is very useful, very respectable, and it can serve a good national development purpose. So it is because of these glamour boys or glamour girls, that is new technologies, we are able to persuade the policymakers to accept distance education as an important system. Otherwise, it was treated as a substandard secondary system.
That's true.
That's
Well,
a great contribution.
That leads in nicely to my last question, actually, as a really difficult question for each of you. But if you had 30 seconds to advise your government on its policy towards open and distance learning, what would it be, given all these changes that are taking place? Who would like to start on that little test?
Well, we are already in the game. Our own government would like to use open and distance learning to educate more and more school children. That is the latest concern of our government. In addition to that, use it for training and retraining of people in the industry. And what I'm happy about is that governments have started thinking on these lines. For a long time, they were thinking that conventional method was the only method. So that's the contribution made by the technologies.
Right. Judy?
I think in the 30 seconds I would repeat what I had ended up with before, and that is, I think the most important thing we need to concentrate on is identifying the outcomes and the capacities that learners of all ages at all stages need to have, and that if we focus on the outcomes and capacities that we want school age or university or college or workers to have, and then ask ourselves how best we can give them those capacities. That, I think, is the critical question for policymakers to help us, to give us a framework that will let us work towards those kinds of issues.
Richard?
Yeah, I think in my situation, the most important thing would be to provide for the development of distance education in our policy, documents. Currently, the Zambian government is working on the new education policy, and from what I hear in terms of discussions, distance education is likely to feature prominently. And this is important because if the government doesn't play an important and leading role, there is a danger that we'll go back to the old-fashioned distance education, because we have a number of private colleges now mushrooming and purporting to be providing distance learning courses when in fact they are providing correspondence courses, and that might have a negative effect on the development of distance education.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just going to add my own comment on that. My advice to government would be, forget the camera and think about the film. It's the content that's really important, and government should be investing in making sure that there is high quality content to flow across these new technologies. And those countries that develop high quality content, rather than investing in infrastructure, because private sector will do that, will be the ones that will survive economically. So thank you all very much for your wisdom and guidance on this, and I'm sure that Commonwealth of Learning will be very happy to be able to disseminate this to policymakers throughout the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is sugar. We're going to use about 3/4 of a cup. Put it into some boiling water. And we're going to give it a real good stir.
Till it dissolves.
That's right.
Okay.
And now we'll pour it directly into our beer. this does is it causes secondary fermentation in the bottle.
And bubbles?
That's right, bubbles. We're going to give it a really gentle stir here, just enough to get the sugar mixed in. You don't want to aerate the beer.
What sauce you got there?
Well, this is a bottle filler. It's bottling day.
Well, how's it work?
Well, as you can see, we've already got our siphon started. I'm going to pop this thing in the end. And now the magic starts.
Wow. That's pretty great, but how do you stop it when you have to fill the next bottle?
Well, there's a little valve at the bottom that lets it flow when it's down and stops when you lift it.
Impressive. So convenient. Holy cow.
Now, as you can see, there's a little bit of headspace in there. We got to leave that in there because we were talking before about secondary fermentation.
Or bubbles.
That's right. We're going to need some space for that here to go.
Well, let me have a go.
Okay, you go ahead.
Okay. Alright.
Now, when we brew a batch of beer, we'd be filling about 72 of these bottles. But we can also use plastic bottles and screw caps.
So good for like picnic or something.
That's right.
Wow, whoa.
Stop.
Hey. Not bad. I could do this all day. Look at these caps on.
Well, you're going to need one of these. That's a Larix capper. I got it down at the home beer supply shop.
Oh, well, do show me how it works.
Well, it got the cap on right. There's a magnet in there to make sure it stays in place. We'll put that on top. Push. And squeeze.
How do you see that?
Nothing to it. You want to try?
Wow, absolutely. Okay, let's see. Cap on. 2 hands. And down?
That's right.
Like that?
Yep. Perfect.
Wow, that looks great.
Now, I've got my handy dandy marking pen because there's a little spot in here so I can mark what kind of beer it is.
Lager, right?
That's right. It's a Cooper's Lager, and I'm going to mark a 1 on there so I know it's batch number 1. Alright, now all our beer is marked, labeled, bottled, ready to go, but we do have to wait for it to finish its secondary fermentation in the bottle. So, we're going to move it for about 2 weeks to a warm, dark place.
How about back in the closet?
That's a great place. But after that, for storage sake, we're going to put it somewhere cooler.
Okay. Well, let's go.
We've already made a Cooper's Lager from a kit. Now we're going to try something a little bit more exotic. We're going to make a beer with an unhopped malt extract. In our last recipe, we used 1 kilogram of sugar. In this case, we're going to use another can of malt extract and just a little bit of sugar to help the fermentation get started. We're also going to be using cracked specialty grain, in this case, crystal malt. And we're going to be adding our own hops this time. And these are hop pellets. The style of beer we're going to make this time is a pale ale. The first step we're going to do is add our cracked grains, and our pale ale recipe calls for 500 grams of crystal malt. This grain bag here is pretty well much like a tea bag. I'm going to put it over top of the grain here, and then pour all the grain in. I'll tie it off and take it over to my brew pot. Now we're ready to steep our grains. What that means is we're going to be raising the temperature up from cold to about 150 degrees Fahrenheit. We're going to do that on a medium-high heat, but we don't want to boil them. We want to just extract the good flavors. So we'll turn the stove to medium-high, put our lid on, And that should take about 20 minutes or so. While that's happening, I'm going to take these cans, soften up the contents by putting them in a sink full of hot water. So it's been about 20 minutes or so. Let's take a look inside. Well, it looks like it's done its job. There's lots of color in there and it smells really good. We're going to take our grain bag out now. We'll let that drip out. And then put it into this jug. And we're also going to be adding our bittering hops. Now we do have some other hops there, but we'll talk about those later. Now we're going to turn this on to high. We're going to try and get up to a really good rolling boil for about 20 minutes. We need that full 20 minutes to extract the flavors out of the hop pellets. Now I'm opening my cans of malt extract. Both these cans are going to go right into the brew pot. And make sure we use a spatula to get all the good stuff out. Now we've left a little bit of malt in the can, so we're going to go back over to the sink, get some hot water, and try and get it all into our brew pot. Alright, now we're stirred in our malt extract. Now we're going to add the sugar we talked about earlier. Once again, this is just going to help get the fermentation started. And add our other kind of hops, and they're called finishing hops. Finishing hops impart some flavor to the beer, but mostly what they add is aroma. We'll stir them in. Now let's recap our recipe. Our pale ale started with 500 grams of cracked crystal malt steeped in 5 liters of water, about 20 minutes at 150 degrees. Then we added 50 grams of bittering hops in for about 20 minutes in the boil. Then we added 2 cans of Cooper's unhopped malt extract, quarter cup of sugar, and at the very end, 14 grams of finishing hops. Our next step is to add our wort to our primary fermenter, just like we did in the Cooper's Lager recipe. Then follow the procedures just as before.
Presenting Cooper's homebrew lineup. Cooper's, #1 in worldwide sales, now with 6 distinct styles, so you can finally brew beer like the experts.